Chapter 1. The city was dying, and it was singing as it went. A low vibration woven into the bones of New London shivered through the reinforced plascrete of Tower 7. Saul felt it in his teeth, in his breath, in the marrow of his skull. It was not sound, not entirely, not something that could be blocked with hands over ears or drowned beneath the city's industrial drone. It was inside him, threading through muscle, settling deep in the crevices of thought. It had begun as a whisper, barely more than an itch at the edge of awareness. Now it was a pulse, slow and methodical, wrapping itself around his mind like wire through wax. This time it was different. This time it wanted him to listen. Through the curved polymer of his apartment window, the domes of New London, hunched against a horizon, stained the colour of old bruises, where the light of the real sun never reached. Acid storms had stripped the city's outer layers to pockmarked ruin, but inside, the lie of stability endured. Emergency drones flitted across the nearest dome, their welding arms spitting blue sky sparks as they sealed fresh fractures. Below, cleaning bots scuttled across the pavements, their brushed whirring as they scrubbed blood from the streets. The dead had begun to move again. Saul exhaled, slow and measured, trying to suppress the gnawing certainty that something had shifted. The air tasted of tin and synthetic lilac, a chemical deception meant to calm the masses. But beneath it lurked something else, something acrid, metallic, and wrong. A trick of the air filters, a fault in the dome's circulation, something simple, explainable. But the song had returned, and this time it was growing louder. Saul's hands trembled as he filled a tin cup with tepid water from the tap. Tower 7's plumbing groaned, the pipe shuddering in sympathy with the city's strange melody. The song seemed to modulate with his heartbeat now, as if calibrating itself to his particular frequency. He pressed the cup to his lips, but couldn't bring himself to drink. 3 weeks since the first wave of deaths. 6 days since the public announcement about neurological anomalies affecting certain districts. 12 hours since his neighbour, old Mrs. Harwick, had walked calmly through her safety glass and plummeted 38 floors to the street below, her face a mask of serene acceptance. TyroCorp's response had been swift and meaningless, platitudes flowing from screens mounted in every corridor, every lift, every public place, assurances that the situation was being addressed, that the Institute's brightest minds were working on solutions. Saul knew better. He had seen the memos, the confidential reports passed between department heads with increasingly frantic urgency. Whatever was happening wasn't an anomaly. It wasn't random. It was targeted. And worst of all, it was familiar. The cup slipped from his fingers, shattering against the kitchen tiles. Water spread in a thin pool at his feet, but Saul barely noticed. The song had shifted again, adopting a new rhythm that pulled at something deep in his memory. His head throbbed as equations and fragments of code flickered behind his eyes. His own work twisted into shapes he had never intended. "No," he whispered, pressing the palms of his hands against his temples. That's not what it was for. 3 years ago, he had developed a theoretical framework for mind-machine interfaces. Quantum encryption designed to shield human consciousness from external influence. Protection from the psychological warfare that had become commonplace since the fall of the Masters. Defense against the void they had left behind. Now those same equations pulse through New London's network, inverted, weaponized. Over 100 years had passed since the Masters fell, and humanity had yet to reclaim what was lost. The war had left scars too deep to heal. Entire continents remained uninhabitable, their soil poisoned by decades of alien control. Cities like New London had risen in the aftermath, enclosed corporate-owned refuges where survival came at a cost. And, among them, walked the shells. No one knew who had built them first. The histories said they had been designed, born from human hands, forged as enforcers to maintain order after the fall of the Masters. But their code, deep, elegant, unreadable, suggested something older, something inherited. Now they were everywhere, watching, waiting, and they did not stop the dying. The vid screen in his living area flickered to life unbidden, the Tyro Corp logo rotating slowly against a backdrop of calming blue. Saul froze, one hand halfway to his temple, where a sudden stabbing pain had taken root. The screen shouldn't activate without his command. That level of override required council authority. This is a city-wide emergency broadcast, announced a measured female voice. All citizens are advised to remain in their dwellings. Security forces have been deployed to ensure public safety. Please stand by for further information. The message repeated, the voice neutral, empty of the panic that should accompany such words. Saul moved to the window again, gazing down at streets that should have been crowded with the evening shift change. Instead, they stretched empty, gleaming wetly in the artificial twilight. The cleaning bots had done their work efficiently. His gaze drifted upward, past the neighboring towers with their darkened windows, beyond the cracked dome where repair units worked with frantic precision. Of course, it hadn't always been this way. His grandfather's tales painted a different world, one where the real sun still warmed actual soil, where food grew from the earth rather than vat cultures, where rain fell without burning flesh. A world before the Masters, before the shells, before New London, before the lottery. Saul turned from the window, his gaze falling to the shrine in the corner of his apartment. Jessica's scarf, still draped over Mare's final drawing. The crayon lines were faded, worn by time, but the image was clear. Stick figures beneath Trion's triple moons, a world Mare had dreamed of but would never see. She had drawn herself reaching for the stars, taller in wax than she had ever lived to be. 2 years, and still the sight of it stole the breath from his lungs. The melody pressed deeper, seeping into the cracks of his grief, wrapping around his memories with velvet tenderness. Forget Saul. It doesn't have to hurt anymore. He clenched his fists, driving his nails into his palms until the sting cut through the fog creeping into his mind. He knew this feeling, knew what it wanted. He'd seen what happened to those who gave in. That day still burned in his memory, burnt and branded in acid and grief. The lottery was supposed to be salvation, a chance at a new life on the colony ships, away from dying Earth, away from the poisoned soil and tainted air. A chance to begin again. 1 in 1,000 selected, 1 in 1,000 saved. Jessica had won. Jessica and Maya both. But only Saul had seen the truth in the shell's prismatic eyes. When they came to escort his family to the embarkation zone, only Saul had noticed the slight difference in their gait, the subtle wrongness in their movements. Only Saul had tried to stop them, and failed. The security footage came later, the ship lifting off, burning through the atmosphere, the explosion, brief and brilliant against the twilight sky, visible even through New London's haze. A terrible accident, the council had called it. A tragic loss. A necessary sacrifice. Saul knew better. He calculated the trajectory. That ship had never been meant for the stars. I should have been with you, he whispered to the empty room, to the faded drawing, to the ghost that haunted every corner of his life. I should have. Movement across the street caught his eye. Outside, across the street, a man in a Tyrocorp uniform stood on his balcony, swaying slightly. His movements were unnatural, his head tilted at an odd angle. Tendons stood rigid in his neck as he gripped the railing, his fingers bloodless with the force of it. A wedding band glinted in the city's artificial light. Saul exhaled sharply, panic rising. Security override, he rasped. Activate isolation protocols. Nothing. The city had fallen silent. No shouts, no traffic, no movement below, just the hum of the repair drones, the whisper of the cleaning bots, and the steady, measured pulse of the song. The man stepped onto the railing. Saul pressed his hands against the polymer glass, his breath fogging the surface. Don't! The man turned his head, not towards Saul, towards something only he could see. And then he stepped forward into nothing. A shell stood on the pavement below, its body mechanized but organic, refracting the city's twilight into spectral hues. It did not react as the body struck the ground with a sickening finality. Its orange eyes flickered, tracking the descent, recording the data, watching. Saul's stomach twisted. The shells were protectors. That was the lie. They could stop an act of violence before it began, calculate probabilities with a speed no human mind could match. But here they stood, motionless, witnessing the fall of New London with a detachment colder than the steel beneath their synthetic flesh. He stumbled back from the window, pressing his hands over his ears, though he knew it would do nothing to block the song. It had wormed its way into the electrical impulses of his brain, riding the same frequencies that had once allowed him to interface with the city's security network. When Saul had first joined the Institute, Tyrocorp's research division had seemed like salvation, a chance to build something meaningful from the ruins of the old world. He'd been naive enough to believe the corporate platitudes, the promises that their work would protect what remained of humanity. Jackson, his supervisor, had encouraged that belief in his own sardonic way. We're all that stands between order and chaos, he'd said once, lips quirked in what might have been amusement or disdain. Though sometimes I wonder if we're just rearranging furniture on a sinking ship. A memory surfaced, sharp and sudden. Jackson, 6 months ago, calling Saul into his office, after hours. The older man's face had been drawn, his usual sarcasm absent. On his desk, a stack of reports bearing security clearance, well above their level. "You ever wonder why the masters left, Saul?" Jackson had asked, his voice low, measured. "Just packed up and disappeared after ruling Earth for centuries. The official history says we drove them off. Heroic human resistance, all that rubbish. But look at what they left behind." He had gestured toward the window where a shell stood motionless on the street below. "Those aren't leftovers. They're waiting." Saul had dismissed it as a conspiracy theory, the paranoia of a mind too exposed to New London's particular brand of corporate desperation. Now, he wasn't so sure. The song shifted, its harmonics evolving. Saul recognized the structure now. Patterns within patterns. Something intricately woven through his thoughts. His work. Quantum encryption models, security matrices he had developed at the Institute. Algorithms meant to shield minds, not strip them bare. And yet here they were, transformed into something that bypassed every defense he had once trusted. "You couldn't have saved them," the song murmured, twining around his regret. "But you can join them now." His legs moved of their own accord, carrying him toward the window. The emergency release panel glowed amber beneath his palm. The safety glass reflected his face, pale, hollow-eyed, slack, with the same surrender he had seen in Jessica's gaze at the end. One press, one step, and it will be over. "The world is written in code, Saul," his grandfather's voice, breaking through the static, sharp as a struck match, yanking him back from the abyss. "And coders always leave back doors." A memory. 10 years old, his grandfather's book-crammed study, a relic of a world before the master's rule. Sheila, the old man's Nexian wife, watching him from the doorway, her compound eyes catching the lamplight in fractured geometries. Nexians had been rare even before the masters came, one of the Earth's few indigenous non-human species. Their evolution had taken a different path from mammals, 8-limbed exoskeletal with compound eyes that processed light in ways human minds could barely comprehend. They had survived the master's culling by retreating to the deepest ocean trenches, emerging only after the alien tripods had departed, their population decimated, but their knowledge intact. Sheila had been a cryptographer, like Saul's grandfather. They had worked together during the Reconstruction, developing quantum encryption systems to protect the fragile remains of human civilization from whatever might come next. Saul had spent his childhood summers in their home, absorbing their knowledge, learning to see the world as they did, as layers of code waiting to be deciphered. "The masters never really left," his grandfather had told him once, late at night when Sheila was out of earshot. "They just evolved. Nothing disappears completely, Saul. It just changes form." Saul staggered back from the window, his breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. He bit his tongue until he tasted blood in his mouth, forcing himself to think through the haze. The song was a weapon, but weapons could be dismantled. His apartment felt suddenly alien, every shadow hostile. How long before the song overwhelmed his resistance? How many others were fighting it now, alone in their sealed flats, trying to hold on to sanity as the melody rewrote their minds? Saul forced himself to move, to focus. His security systems were down, but his private terminal might still work. The old model he kept disconnected from New London's network, running on systems his grandfather had designed. If he could analyze the song's structure, find its source. The terminal screen flickered to life at his touch, then died. Not a power failure, the apartment's lights still functioned. A directed interruption. Someone knew what he was trying to do. He yanked open the drawer beneath his desk, fingers scrabbling for the small device hidden there. The cryptographic interface was outdated technology, barely the size of his palm, its casing scratched from years of use. But it ran on isolated systems, immune to New London's network. If anything could decode the song, his datapad chimed. A priority message from Tyro Corp. Institute personnel report to the hub. Your expertise is vital. Saul stared at the words, his pulse hammering. They wanted him to perfect it, to refine the song, make it irresistible. Beneath the datapad, buried in the clutter of his desk, lay his grandfather's final letter. He had dismissed it as paranoia, the ramblings of a dying man. But the words burned now with undeniable truth. The culling has begun. The lottery isn't chance. Exodus isn't escape. They use the master's codes, translated through your work. The shells aren't guardians. Study their refractions. The truth survives in Sheila's eyes. The ticket I left you isn't passage. It's a key. Burn this. Saul hadn't burnt it. That had been his first mistake. His second had been mentioning it to Jackson 3 months ago, when the dreams had started. Dreams of Jessica and Maya. Not as they had been. Maya's laugh like small bells. Jessica's eyes crinkling at the corners when she smiled. But as they had ended, cold, distant. Stepping into the embarkation chamber with mechanical precision, their eyes fixed on something he couldn't see. Jackson had listened with uncharacteristic stillness. His usually sardonic expressions shuttered. Dreams are the mind's way of processing trauma, he'd said finally with a clinical detachment that felt rehearsed. But if they persist, the company has resources counselling, medication. A week later, the first reports of the singing sickness had emerged. People walking from their jobs, their homes, their lives. Unnervingly accurate movements Saul knew from his dreams. All heading toward the hub. Saul gathered what he needed quickly. The cryptographic interface, his grandfather's letter, the datapad with its summons, and Jessica's crystal. The necklace had been a gift on their 5th anniversary, a teardrop of Nexian quartz that seemed to hold light long after darkness fell. Jessica had worn it every day, but it had been absent from the security footage of the embarkation. Absent from the inventory of her personal effects. Because it had been here, hidden in Saul's desk drawer, where he had placed it the night before the lottery results were announced. A simple superstition, something old, something borrowed, for luck. Some luck. He slipped the crystal round his neck, its weight unfamiliar against his chest. The smooth stones seemed to pulse with a rhythm that countered the song, creating a pocket of clarity in the fog that threatened to engulf his thoughts. Through the window, he could see the movement in the street below. People emerging from buildings, walking with the same unnatural coordination as the man who had jumped. And among them moved the shells, their prismatic bodies catching the light in complex ways. They did not interfere with the procession. They merely observed, recorded, followed. A security drone hovered near his window, its camera focusing on his apartment with obvious intent. They knew he hadn't responded to the summons. They were coming for him. Saul closed his eyes, forcing his breathing to steady. Think. There were service corridors between the towers, maintenance shafts that honeycomb New London's substructure. Routes that bypassed the main thoroughways where shells and security drones would be waiting. And he knew where they led. Every shaft, every corridor, every forgotten access point had been mapped in his grandfather's final project, a comprehensive security assessment of New London commissioned by Tyrocorp itself, then buried when the results proved too disturbing to share. The city was riddled with spaces that shouldn't exist, sublevels that appeared on no official blueprint, power draws that couldn't be explained, signal patterns that originated from nowhere and terminated in darkness. His grandfather had died 3 days after submitting the report. A cardiac event, the medical drones had declared, unavoidable, tragic. A heavy knock echoed through the apartment. The security algorithm on Saul's door chimed warning. They were here. Called a voice, measured and inhuman. A shell. Saul moved silently to the bedroom, pressing his palm against the hidden scanner built into the baseboard, another of his grandfather's patents. A section of wall slid aside, revealing a narrow passage that shouldn't exist in standard Tower 7 architecture. The apartment door hissed open behind him. Heavy footsteps entered the living area. Not the light step of a shell, but something heavier. Security drones. Saul slipped into the passage as the bedroom door slid open. The last thing he saw was a figure silhouetted against the light. Humanoid, but wrong. Its proportions subtly distorted, as if human shape were an ill-fitting costume it had donned for convenience. Not a shell. Not a drone. Something else. The passage sealed behind him, plunging him into darkness, broken only by the dim blue emergency strips that lined the floor. The air was stale, thick with the smell of disused machinery and ozone. But it was quiet here. The song faded to a distant hum, more memory than presence. Saul moved quickly, following the path he had memorized from his grandfather's files. The passage sloped downward, taking him deep into Tower 7's foundations. According to official records, there were 5 sublevels beneath New London's residential towers. Maintenance, power distribution, water reclamation, waste processing, and storage. His grandfather had found 20. The passage ended at a maintenance lift, ancient tech, manual controls that required no network connection. Saul punched in the access code, praying that it hadn't been changed in the decades since his grandfather's death. The lift groaned to life, its mechanisms protesting after years of disuse. It began to descend, taking Saul deep beneath the city, away from the shells, away from the song, toward whatever waited below. The lift passed the known sublevels, their indicator lights flickering past with increasing speed. 5, 8, 12, 15. At 20, it stopped. The doors opened onto darkness, broken only by the dim glow of emergency lighting that traced the outlines of a vast chamber. The air was different here, colder, sharper, carrying scents that didn't belong beneath a sealed city. Soil, water, growing things. Saul stepped out, his hand closing around the cryptographic interface in his pocket. The lift doors shut behind him with a finality that sent a shiver down his spine. No going back. His eyes adjusted to the dim light. Shapes emerged from the darkness. The chamber was enormous, its ceiling lost in shadow, its walls curving away beyond the reach of the emergency strips. And everywhere, lining those walls, filling the space in orderly rows, were pods, thousands of them, translucent, filled with fluid that glowed with a faint, sickly light, and inside each, a human form, suspended in perfect stillness. Saul moved closer, drawn by a terrible certainty. The nearest pod contained a woman, middle-aged, her face composed in an expression of serene acceptance. Her eyes were open, but unseeing, fixed on something beyond the curved surface of her prison. Mrs. Harwick, his neighbour, the one he had watched fall. But she hadn't fallen, or rather she had, but this was her, still here, still whole. A copy, a replica so perfect that even the wedding ring on her finger caught the light exactly as the original had. Saul staggered back, his mind reeling. The security footage of Jessica and Maya walking to their doom with that same serene expression. The reports of mass suicides in the outer district. The lottery. They weren't selecting people for salvation, they were selecting models for replication. Perfect copies. Empty vessels waiting to be filled. But filled with what? The song surged, finding him even here, its melody wrapping around his thoughts with fresh urgency. Saul clutched Jessica's crystal, focusing on its solid reality as the music threatened to dissolve his sense of self. A figure stepped from between the rows of pods, the face still hidden in the shadows, but definitely human, possibly. "Saul Shen," came the whisper. That voice. Recognizable. Saul backed away, his hand closing around the cryptographic interface in his pocket. "Who are you?" The figure stepped forward, forcing Saul to take another step in retreat. His back hit something solid. Another pod. He glanced over his shoulder and froze. Inside, floating in the same sickly fluid as the others, was a face he knew all too well. His own. He turned back as the figure moved into the dim light. "Who are you?" Saul said cautiously. The man stepped closer. As the light hit his face, Saul could see his grave expression. "I'm here to get you out of here, Saul. They know about you." "They?" "The Shells. They're coming. We have to go now." The man turned and headed for a dark opening in the chamber wall. "This way." Saul hesitated for a moment, looking back at the rows of pods, still in silent shock, and then at the figure of his own copy, and then back to the man. Searching within himself for answers, so many questions, but the urgency in the man's voice was convincing. Reluctantly, Saul turned and followed him into the darkness.